Did you know that a single maneuver by Verstappen could have changed the entire 2025 F1 season? What seemed like a simple 10-second penalty hides a much more complex story involving regulations, tension between teams, and a Red Bull struggling to stay on top. Before continuing, tell me in the comments, do you think the penalty was fair or was it an excessive punishment for Max? Are we seeing the most dangerous Verstappen or the most desperate? In this video, we'll break down everything that happened with Max Verstappen at the 2025 Spanish GP, from the controversial incident with George Russell to the technical and psychological consequences that could define the remainder of the season. To understand the true impact of Max Verstappen's penalty at the 2025 Spanish GP, we must first put the pieces of the puzzle together. Max isn't just a competitive driver, he's the face of Red Bull racing and a constant protagonist in every championship battle in recent years. He's built a reputation for being aggressive, fast, and determined, someone who doesn't give a single inch on the track without a fight. But it's precisely that intensity, that all-or-nothing mentality, that starts to work against him when things don't go his way. The 2025 season hasn't been easy for Red Bull. The team started with certain technical deficiencies that were especially noticeable on demanding circuits, where the setup of the RB21 exposed issues with tire wear and aerodynamic balance. Meanwhile, McLaren and Mercedes have taken advantage of this setback to raise their game. Piastri has become the most consistent driver of the year, and Lando Norris isn't far behind. All of this has put Verstappen in an unusual situation for him. He's no longer leading with authority. Now he's forced to fight for every point, every position, even when the car isn't responding as he expects. And when a driver like Verstappen feels the championship slipping away, the margin for error becomes narrower and the tension more intense. In that context, what happened in Barcelona makes much more sense. It wasn't just a bad decision on the track, it was the reflection of a driver on the edge, facing internal and external pressure, trying to maintain what for years was absolute dominance. Max isn't used to looking up the leaderboard. He's used to dictating the pace, not chasing it. The relationship between Red Bull and Verstappen has also entered a different phase. Although the team continues to publicly support him, there are clear signs that strategic decisions are becoming increasingly risky, as if seeking to compensate with unusual maneuvers for what the car can no longer deliver naturally. In this constant tension between an aggressive strategy and the need for immediate results, the likelihood of errors increases. And while this can create a spectacle, it also opens the door to sanctions, criticism, and wear and tear that can affect the rest of the season. By the time we reached the Spanish GP, Verstappen was already nursing frustration over what happened in Saudi Arabia, where he was penalized after another controversial incident with Oscar Piastri. That penalty, although minor, marked the beginning of a narrative that seems to be repeating itself. Max makes decisions on the edge of the rules, and when the consequences come, controversy is inevitable. Therefore, what happened with George Russell is not an isolated incident. It is the latest chapter in a season where Verstappen is no longer just competing against his rivals, but also against his own emotions. The context surrounding this penalty goes far beyond the collision with Russell. It is a snapshot of what Max is experiencing in 2025, a more competitive environment, a car that no longer gives him a clear advantage, increasing pressure to maintain his position, and an almost desperate need to remain the benchmark. All of this puts a scrutiny on every maneuver, and every mistake weighs twice as much. The Barcelona accident not only cost him points, it also reinforced a dangerous narrative, that of a driver who, feeling on the ropes, is willing to take more risks than necessary. Tensions exploded in the closing laps of the Spanish Grand Prix. Max Verstappen was locked in a direct fight with George Russell for fourth place. Both knew what was at stake: valuable championship points, on-track reputation, and above all, a statement of strength in the middle of a season that doesn't forgive mistakes. At that moment, Red Bull gave Verstappen a direct instruction. He had to give the position back to Russell. The order didn't come on a whim. It was a logical consequence of a previous maneuver that exceeded the acceptable limits of the regulations. The situation required clarity, but what happened next was anything but. Max, far from giving up his place cleanly, suddenly slowed down right in a difficult-to-maneuver area. The action, at least on the surface, seemed to follow the team's orders. But in practice, what it did was put Russell in an awkward position. forcing him to react with little room and little confidence. As soon as George attempted the overtake, Verstappen abruptly resumed the line, and lateral contact was inevitable. For the stewards, the interpretation was clear. It wasn't a simple confusion, but a deliberate action that put the other driver's safety at risk and broke the spirit of the regulations. The key to the conflict isn't just the physical contact, but the intention behind the maneuver. When a driver needs to give up position, they do so safely, without endangering their rival or manipulating the pace of the race. But Max, according to the official report, acted with a mixture of frustration and calculation. He didn't want to simply give away the spot. He wanted to do it on his terms, at the point where Russell could gain the least advantage. That attitude, although typical of a fierce competitor, crossed an invisible line, the one that separates strategic astuteness from unsportsmanlike behavior. And this wasn't an isolated perception. George Russell made it clear at the end of the race. From his perspective, the maneuver was unnecessary and dangerous. He asserted that Verstappen not only slowed down unexpectedly, but also moved toward him at the critical moment. This is no small accusation. It implies intent, a conscious decision to block rather than concede. For a driver like Russell, who is playing for his own promotion at Mercedes, such incidents can change the course of a race and an entire season. The penalty came hours after the end. 10 seconds added to Verstappen's time relegated him from 5th to 10th place. Beyond the loss of positions, what really resonated was the message. The FIA not only punished a one-off action, it also made it clear that it is willing to toughen its stance on repeated behavior. This wasn't the first time Verstappen was involved in a situation like this in 2025. The incident with Oscar Piastri in Saudi Arabia was still fresh in the minds of many. On that occasion, Max received a minor penalty, but the pattern of behavior began to take shape. The incident with Russell ended up becoming a public statement from the stewards. It's not enough to give away a position if you do it maliciously. You can't obey a team order and at the same time manipulate the way it's carried out. That ambiguity, that duality of behavior, was what bothered the FIA the most, and what most alarmed his rivals. Because if Max acts like this under pressure, what can we expect when the gap with the championship leader continues to grow? From the audience's perspective, the maneuver divided opinions. Some saw it as the hallmark of the competitive Verstappen of old, the one who gives no respite and turns every order into an act of resistance. Others, however, interpreted it as a sign that the Dutchman is losing emotional control when things don't go his way. That perception is dangerous, because in a sport like Formula One, where image also counts, starting to be seen as a problematic driver can have far-reaching consequences beyond a simple time penalty. This incident didn't just alter the outcome of a race. It also left a feeling of vulnerability in the air for a driver who used to appear invincible. And that has profound implications. Because when such a dominant competitor starts making errors in judgment, the entire F1 ecosystem shifts. Rivals become emboldened, teams adjust strategies, and internal confidence is shaken. In this context, Verstappen didn't just lose 5 positions. He lost, albeit momentarily, some of the authority he used to wield on the track without needing words. After the media and sporting impact of the penalty at the Spanish Grand Prix, all eyes turned to one place, the Red Bull garage. The question was inevitable. How would the team, which has built its identity around Max Verstappen, react? The response was measured, diplomatic, and carefully calibrated to avoid adding fuel to the fire. But between the lines, there were clear signs of how this tense moment is being experienced internally. Team principal Christian Horner avoided direct statements about the penalty. Instead, he shifted the focus to the RB21's technical improvements, highlighting the new aerodynamic implementations and the progress in performance on high-load circuits. This communication strategy is no coincidence. Instead of confronting the steward's decision, Red Bull chose to focus attention on the car's development. It's an elegant way of taking the pressure off the driver, but also an indication that there is an effort within the team not to rock the boat further. However, the specific silence regarding the maneuver speaks louder than any explicit defense. On other occasions, when Max was controversially penalized, Red Bull didn't hesitate to issue firm, even defiant statements. This time was different. There was no confrontation. There were no complaints. What there was a narrative of caution. And that can be interpreted as a sign that, for the first time in a long time, the team is beginning to accept that its star driver can also make mistakes. Max, for his part, also remains silent. This absence of voice at a key moment contrasts with his usual attitude. Verstappen is not a driver who holds back his opinions. He tends to be direct, straightforward, even provocative if he deems it necessary. But on this occasion, he chose to remain silent. Was it his own decision? A recommendation from the team? Whatever the reason, the truth is that his absence from the post-race speech reinforced the idea that the incident touched a sore spot within the team. And Red Bull is experiencing a period of redefinition. For years, the car was superior. Strategic decisions worked like clockwork, and Verstappen, at his best, transformed each race into a declaration of dominance. Today, that scenario has changed. The RB21 has limitations. McLaren has made a significant technical leap, and Mercedes has begun to catch up. In this context, the room for maneuver is much smaller, and that forces the team to think differently. It's no longer enough to have the fastest driver. It requires precision, discipline, and an emotional balance that hasn't always been Max's strong suit. The team has introduced structural changes to the car. New wings, tweaks to the cooling system, and improvements to the rear suspension are part of a clear strategy to regain competitiveness on technical circuits. But while the engineering team tries to close the gap with its rivals, the driver's emotional management becomes an equally great challenge. Because when Verstappen feels the car isn't responding as he expects, his frustration translates into risky decisions, and those decisions have consequences, as demonstrated in Barcelona. Ultimately, Red Bull faces a classic dilemma: how to balance the indomitable nature of its main asset with the need to maintain order and clarity in critical moments. Verstappen has been the heart of the team, but he can also be the most unpredictable element if he doesn't feel supported or if he perceives that the situation is overwhelming him. This delicate internal balance is today one of the most determining factors for the team's immediate future. Furthermore, there is an aspect that cannot be ignored. The relationship between Verstappen and Red Bull has been built on results. As long as they were winning, everything worked. But now that the championship is getting tighter and the penalties are starting to pile up, the bond is being tested. And when that relationship enters fragile territory, the team's decisions take on another dimension. Blindly supporting the driver is no longer a safe option. They must consider the impact each incident has on team morale, on sponsors, and on the public perception of a structure that has always presented itself as implacable. What's most interesting is that, while Red Bull takes a more technical and restrained stance, the rest of the paddock is watching closely. Teams like Mercedes and McLaren have already expressed their agreement with the sanction, and that's also part of the political landscape of Formula One. Every statement, every silence, every move counts. Red Bull knows it's in a complex situation, and that's why its reaction was calculated. But behind that apparent calm lies a real concern. If Verstappen crosses the line again in another race, the next penalty could not only be a time penalty, but also an internal confidence penalty. With this in mind, it's essential to analyze an angle that goes beyond the immediate. Because if Verstappen were to face another penalty, or an adverse result, how would that affect the overall balance of the championship? And what implications would it have for team morale and the dynamics between drivers and teams? Formula One is a sport where patterns of behavior rarely go unnoticed. When a driver like Max Verstappen begins to display a repetitive pattern of controversial on-track behavior, the reaction isn't limited to penalties alone. The effect is much broader and deeper, with implications that can influence his legacy, his relationship with the team, and even his position within the sports ecosystem. What we saw in Spain wasn't an isolated incident. It was the continuation of an attitude that had already manifested itself in Saudi Arabia, and which is beginning to outline a competitive risk profile that, if left uncorrected, could have a long-term negative impact. First, there's the strictly sporting interpretation. Every time Max makes a punishable maneuver, he doesn't just lose positions. He also loses ground in a championship that this year has become closer than ever. With McLaren capitalizing on every mistake made by its rivals and Mercedes regaining form, there's no longer any room to give away points. Unnecessary contact, a misinterpretation of the rules, or a defiant attitude on track can be the difference between being crowned champion or being eliminated before the final round. And if 2025 has shown anything, it's that this championship will be decided by details. But the real problem arises when that pattern becomes a narrative. Stewards no longer analyze incidents as isolated events. They evaluate history, repetitions, and attitudes. If Verstappen continues with this type of maneuver, he will not only be punished more severely, but he will also lose the benefit of the doubt. And in a sport where every second counts, being in the constant crosshairs of the authorities can completely influence your racing. The room for maneuver shrinks, the pressure increases, and the smallest infraction can result in an exemplary punishment. In addition, there is the internal effect within Red Bull. A driver who constantly compromises the team's results by making risky decisions on track can become a liability, even if he is the most talented. For now, support for Max remains intact, but if the incidents continue and the results aren't forthcoming, that trust could erode. In the past, teams like Ferrari and McLaren have had to make difficult decisions when their star drivers became sources of conflict rather than solutions. And while it's hard to imagine, Red Bull isn't immune to such tensions. We must also consider the effect this pattern has on rivals. When other drivers feel they can't trust a competitor's behavior, mutual respect is lost. And when respect is lost on the track, racing becomes more aggressive, more unpredictable, and more dangerous. George Russell has already expressed his frustration openly. Piastri, without naming him directly, made it clear that he expects a greater commitment to fair play. If Max continues down this path, he could encounter resistance not only from the FIA, but also from the peloton itself, which will not hesitate to set increasingly harsh limits. The public also plays a fundamental role. The fans who once celebrated him as the unstoppable driver are now beginning to divide. Social media bears witness to this rift. Some defend him tooth and nail, seeing his aggression as a natural trait of champions. But there are also those who see him as an increasingly arrogant figure, incapable of accepting mistakes and too prone to causing chaos instead of fair competition. That perception weighs heavily, because a driver's public image influences his legacy, his sponsorships, and even the decisions of the brands that surround him. And finally, there is the most complex variable of all, the emotional factor. When a driver enters a cycle of frustration, mistakes, and sanctions, his focus deteriorates. Anger replaces strategy, and pride clouds judgment. Max has shown that, in extreme situations, he tends to escalate conflicts rather than de-escalate them. If this trend continues, he could not only lose championships, he could lose control. And in a sport where everything happens at over 300 kilometers per hour, that can be fatal to your sporting aspirations and to the harmony of your team. With half the championship still to go and a calendar that doesn't forgive mistakes, the upcoming races will be decisive not only for Max Verstappen's aspirations, but also for the overall balance of power on the grid. What's coming up isn't just any old stage of the championship. It's the part where mistakes can no longer be corrected, where every point lost costs double, and where teams begin to play all their cards, both technical and strategic. In this context, Red Bull and Max have to react, but that reaction can't be impulsive. It has to be calculated, firm, and precise. The next round on the calendar is the Austrian Grand Prix, a race that has historically been favorable to Verstappen. Not only because of the layout, which suits his aggressive and direct style, but also because of Red Bull's technical knowledge of the Red Bull Ring. But this time, the situation is different. McLaren arrives with a clear technical advantage in traction and exiting slow corners, two factors that have been key to dominating on demanding mixed-track circuits. If Red Bull doesn't get the setup just right, it's very likely it will fall behind its main rivals again. In technical terms, Red Bull has already announced new updates for Austria. A new flat floor, with redesigned air channels, promises a 0.3 second per lap improvement in twisty sections. Airflow optimization to the diffuser is also expected, which should improve the RB21's rear stability, especially in medium-speed corners. But even if these improvements work, there's no guarantee they'll be enough. McLaren hasn't stopped evolving, and Mercedes is also preparing new parts. The race for technical development is a silent war fought in factories, wind tunnels, and simulators. The other front is psychological. Verstappen arrives with a recent penalty, a questionable image, and a 45-point gap over Oscar Piastri in the championship. This combination of external pressure and internal frustration could backfire if he can't channel it intelligently. It's not just about running fast. It's about making calm decisions, managing critical moments without giving into provocations or destructive impulses. Because at this point in the season, a retirement or another penalty could put him out of a title fight. And Max knows it. Red Bull also faces a strategic dilemma. Should it continue to rely on Verstappen as its only strong suit or start spreading risks and planning for a scenario in which Max can't turn things around? Although it may seem premature, the teams are already thinking ahead, projecting possible combinations of drivers, structures, and objectives for 2026.